Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I'm Adrian Paps. I'm the Deputy Director of Political Economy. Very proud to be leading the public policy team at NIESR, one of two teams. My counterpart of the macro team, Stephen Millard, is with us, as is Jagdit Chadha, the Director. It's great to see so many friends and colleagues for our 2023 NIESR Parliamentary Lecture. NIESR recently celebrated its 85th anniversary, and having been established in 1938, our mission is the same as it was as defined by our founding fathers, amongst others, Keynes and Beveridge. It is about a more accurate understanding of the economic and social forces that shape people's lives, and also helping to design better policy to improve those lives. Now, the Parliamentary Lecture is our annual opportunity to engage with politicians and policymakers, both here in Westminster, but also across the UK, to try and compare notes about the state of the UK economy and society, and also to debate what could and indeed what should be done in order to provide more well-being, better outcomes for people, more growth, of course, more productivity, but also life chances and much else besides. The inaugural lecture was delivered by the Labour MP, John Cruddas, and he proposed a very different reading of the productivity puzzle, saying it's not a puzzle, it's really a problem. We know really why the performance has been low, and we shouldn't be talking about disease and miracle, we should be really talking about the underlying causes. So a very provocative and in some ways quite controversial take on it, and we've just published it in our own National Institute Economic Review. And I think this really sums up what this lecture and what NIESR is all about. It is about rigorous research, and it is about radical yet realistic policy ideas. And so to our speaker. Jesse Norman will be known to all of you, certainly as the MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire since 2010. So he's now been around for nearly a decade and a half. Though no doubt, Jesse, it feels a lot longer with everything that's been happening here and across the country and indeed the world. You will also know that he is Minister of State in the Department for Transport and has held various ministerial roles, including Financial Secretary to the Treasury between 2019 and 2021, where he managed the Fellow scheme and also helped to set up the UK Infrastructure Bank. What you may not know is that Jesse is also a very outspoken MP, and indeed, I think at least two prime ministers can testify to that. David Cameron, I think there was an incident once that was much talked about over House of Lords reform, I believe, and indeed Boris Johnson, when Jesse, I think, made his views very clear in his letter last summer when he resigned from his ministerial post. But I think what's really of equal importance and indeed of great interest to us here at NIESR is Jesse's intellectual work. I think it's fair to say he's one of the few intellectually curious and courageous members of Parliament. And I think for once I can say I speak for many that, we need more such MPs. And Jesse has been writing and thinking about politics and about policy for a very, very long time, going all the way back to his studies. Unlike many of our illustrious MPs, he didn't read PPE at Oxford, he read classics. And indeed went on to study philosophy, both at MPhil and PhD level at University College London, and has been writing pamphlets and books really ever since. I will just pick out one. There was a conservative critique of crony capitalism, besides also the work on compassionate conservatism and indeed on the big society. And then, of course, two tomes that you'll all know, one on Edmund Burke and the other one on Adam Smith. Now, in this year, where we commemorate the tricentenary of Smith's birth, you might think that Jesse is here to talk about Smith and his legacy and how that can help us perhaps get out of the mess we found ourselves in. But no, Jesse has many, many more interests besides Burke and Smith and conservatism and the big society. One of them is higher education, something that is of great interest to us at NIESR and has been for a very long time. So the talk today is not on Smith, but it is on the political economy of higher education. And it is more specifically on the new Model Institute for Technology and Engineering that Jesse will tell us all about in just a moment. So before I'll ask you to welcome Jesse, just again to say the books that he's written have really been a very significant contribution, because what is distinctive about Jesse's work is that he doesn't just go back in history and think about Burke or Smith or others then. He thinks, what is their relevance for today? And I think that what he's going to tell us about the political higher education isn't just one example about the new Model Institute, but no doubt a picture of where the UK could and indeed should go in terms of higher education and its economic model more generally. That's the sense I get. Now, I'm still waiting for my signed copy of The Winding Stair, I think, but maybe Jesse has brought it. That is the most recent book he's published, came out only last month, a historical novel. It's been received with huge praise. I think some people have said it's better than Hilary Mantel. Before Jesse gets on to talk about that, I think we will now welcome you for this lecture. So ladies and gentlemen, Jesse Norman.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Adrian, for that extremely generous introduction. And what a delight it is to see such a large and distinguished audience. I am enormously grateful to you all for coming out on a cold, wet day. And I should say, just to make one point of clarification, my letter for no confidence in Boris of June last year was not a resignation letter. I'd actually already stepped down in September of 21. And this is just because of my idiotic belief in keeping the historical record as accurate as possible. But thank you otherwise for those very kind words, Adrian. So what an honor it is to speak. It's a delight to be here back at NIESR, where I was a governor and a board member for some years. I'm still a governor, I think. And let me also declare an interest, not just as in relation to NIESR and its fabulous work, but also because I am outside politics, a fellow of an Oxford College and also at the University of St Andrews. And so I do try to keep a kind of very strong, vigorous, active academic engagement alongside the work I do in politics. I'm not speaking as a minister. I'm not going to be discussing current higher education policy. I'm speaking in the character of a backbench MP, but I also have a relationship to the New Model Institute for Technology and Engineering, or NMITE, and I'm going to talk about about that later on in the conversation as well. So this year, as you will need no reminding, is the 300th anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith. And so perhaps it isn't inappropriate to talk a little bit about what one might call the political economy of higher education. It's, as it were, history and its social and political embedding, as well as its economic aspects. And as you will see, perhaps fittingly for the day that we're meeting, this talk is in its own way a declaration of independence. But 2023 also marks the 198th anniversary of the birth of modern higher education. On the 9th of February, 1825, the poet Thomas Campbell wrote a remarkable open letter in the Times newspaper to the educational reformer Henry Brougham, MP. Excuse me. In his letter, Campbell drew attention to the fact that there was no higher education of any description in London at that time, and he called for the creation of a London university. As he put it, and I quote, "The people of London should settle what sort of university they wish for, and it will be their own fault alone if it does not exist." The astonishing thing is that that diagnosis was correct. Oxford had originally come into being as a community of scholars in the late 11th or early 12th century, and Cambridge in the 13th, and for 600 years thereafter, that was it. England had just 2 universities, and they jealously fought to maintain their privilege of granting degrees. And they jealously fought to maintain their privilege of granting degrees, notably in 1333 to 4, when they joined forces to defeat a petition to Edward III to charter a new university in Lincolnshire. So there was an insurgent in 1334, and Oxford and Cambridge buried their historic rivalry in order to join forces and destroy the potential insurgent. Nothing has changed in higher education. Scotland, as we know, however, was a very different story. By 1600, Scotland had 5 universities, not 2, but 5 universities at St Andrews, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and 2 in Aberdeen. Thus, the city of Aberdeen, a place with a population of roughly 10,000 people, described by Pope Alexander VI at its founding as, I quote, separated from the rest of the kingdom by arms of the sea and very high mountains. Aberdeen had as many universities as England. Thomas Campbell and Henry Broome, the sender and recipient of that famous letter, were both Scotsmen, and they could see what a difference to educational opportunity and to economic, social, and cultural growth the Scottish universities had made in their own country. Thus, it took an insurgent institution, University College London, where I took my own MPhil and PhD very happily and delightedly, the university Campbell had called for in his letter to the Times to break the monopoly of Oxbridge in England in the 1820s. And it did so in pioneering style, for it became the first university to admit Catholic, Jewish, and non-conformist students, the first to admit women, and the first to offer external degrees via distance learning, amongst a host of other groundbreaking achievements. These reforms had further institutional effects in turn. The creation of external degrees in particular gave a great boost to new colleges across England and Ireland, and indeed the Empire, as they sought university status. But there were also important fraternal acts of university sponsorship. Balliol College and New College, Oxford, played a key role in establishing Bristol University alongside the Wills family. The University of Newcastle was an offshoot of Durham, and so on. Now, with that historical background in mind, let us fast forward then to the state of higher education today. And it's important to say that in many ways, there's much to celebrate. A recent survey found that 4 UK universities stood in the global top 10 rankings for higher education. And of course, there has been a huge expansion of opportunity. But it's also true to say that there have been serious public concerns, and those have been magnified by the after effects of the pandemic. There have been claims that the funding model is broken. There have been disputes about pay and the quality of degrees in some cases, and of administration. And there have been complaints and concerns about the quality of the student experience, levels of mental ill health, worries about value for money and debt, the impact of AI. But I want to focus on what is, if possible, an even deeper issue, which I think will be of interest to this audience. And that is the effect of Baumoll's cost disease. Now, I pointed this out in Compassionate Conservatism, a pamphlet I wrote in 2006. But I just think it's worth foregrounding again, because its impact actually continues to stand to sit with us, and if anything, is becoming more pronounced. So this audience will need no reminder that in 1966, the economists William Baumoll and William Bowen published a seminal article on productivity in the performing arts. The problem is simply this: imagine you are a member of a string quartet. Every year, you and your colleagues seek a pay rise, but your productivity hardly increases. You can't drop a member and still play the Hofmeister quartet with 3 people. And when you do play it, it will still last just about as long as it did when Mozart wrote it in 1786. If you worked in a car factory, on the other hand, there would be much less of a problem. Productivity has risen hugely in the car industry as a result of technology, automation, and supply chain management improvements. These in turn have generated gains, part of which can be passed on to employees. Costs go up, but output in manufacturing, normally at least, goes up faster. This phenomenon is known among economists as Baumoll's cost disease. It arises generally in service industries, which tend to be hard to automate, hard to standardize, and reliant on the personal touch. If you've ever wondered why new car costs are falling relatively while car repairs are more expensive than ever, then this is a large part of the answer. Now, of course, our public services are just that, services. Hospitals, schools, and old people's homes are precisely the kinds of places whose productivity is hard to raise above trend. As I say, I first pointed this out in Compassionate Conservatism in 2006 and highlighted the effects of Baumoll's cost disease in exerting pressure downward on productivity and upward on public spending. That diagnosis, I think, still has some validity, and it is having a serious impact on the political economy of higher education. It is perhaps the leading contextualizing factor behind the concerns that I've touched on about quality of student experience, the quality of overstretch in staffing, value for money, and the like. There's also a more recent phenomenon that I think also deserves attention, and that is what you might call a lack of diversity and innovation in higher education, a lack of a sense of place in many of our universities. Now, it was not always like this. There's a brilliant book which you may know of by a man called William White called Red Brick. And as White shows, British universities in the 20th century had a very wide array of origins, places, and purposes. But he concludes, fascinatingly, as the steady assimilation of the politics showed, the British proved incapable of rethinking the nature or the form of higher education. Even though an elite system was giving way to mass university access, the old symbols and old assumptions retained their purchase. The result was not the highly differentiated system that the government hoped to create, but a set of strikingly similar institutions, all of them modeled on the civic universities, whose structure, working practices, and architectural forms were the implicit points of comparison throughout. Higher education aped red brick, not Oxbridge. And of course, there is within this context a particular issue that is worth focusing on in technical education. An IFS review in 2022 reported that half a century ago, a third of teenage boys entered apprenticeships on leaving school, mostly into programs of 3 to 4 years in manual trades. A sizable, though much smaller proportion of girls also entered apprenticeships in fields like hairdressing. These apprenticeships provided many young people with a route into stable and secure employment. Now, falling numbers here matter because apprenticeships can help young people into good jobs. A recent study shows that starting an apprenticeship at level 2 or 3 is associated with higher average returns than completing classroom-based vocational qualifications at the same level. For men, apprenticeships raise earnings by 30% and 46% for those educated up to levels 2 and 3, respectively, relative to a classroom-based vocational qualification at the same level. For women, they raise earnings by 10 to 20% for the respective groups. And there's a specific concern even within this area as relates to higher technical qualifications. Compared to other countries, the IFS continues, England has a high share of graduates. Almost half of young people now progress to higher education, yet at the same time, a quarter of working age adults in England aren't even qualified to upper secondary level, that is A level or equivalent, which is over twice the level seen in Germany and the USA. Around 1.5 adults per thousand in the UK population completes a higher technical qualification each year, which is lower than most other developed countries. Adults in the United States are over 4 times more likely to complete a higher technical qualification. So what's the diagnosis then? Or what should we be thinking about this? I'd like to suggest a couple of points. One is that there's a huge missing middle of STEM education, educational opportunity at the moment, and that this is both inequitable and economically foolish. I'd like to suggest that this point about a lack of diversity and a lack of innovation is particularly significant in an area where we all recognize the powerhouse effect of universities in charging economic activity, or that they can have. I'd like to suggest that the undervaluation of skills, which we've seen in the decline of design and technology within schools, points to a wider unwillingness to, in the higher education sector, really to think hard about what the needs of populations outside the ones they serve are across the UK. But the world has changed. People expect to have multiple careers now, young people do. And also, I mean, there is a tremendous need, as we know, for people with STEM skills, and that's only going to increase over the next few years. And I would say something else, possibly more controversial still, which is there's a need for doers. There's a need for people with agency. And I'll come on to why this matters and why it's relevant. Now, at this point, you might be wondering why a talk about universities and higher education has wandered off into the topic of vocational training. The reason for that is that the academic vocational divide and all the associated class and intellectual snobbery that has gone with it for hundreds of years in this country also is not only bad in itself, but it makes a fundamental intellectual mistake. If we don't understand the critical linkages between the intellectual and the practical, between learning and skills, if we don't understand that the two do not just lead to better intellectual outcomes because of the way in which the mind appreciates and absorbs this information, but in the way in which it's fixed and recalled and then used, then we will condemn ourselves to a kind of social, economic, and mental sterility. Now, let me give you an imagined history that, as it were, picks up the point here. And I'm not suggesting this is true, I'm just painting a picture for you, and you can decide whether it bears any veracity or not. To do that, I want to introduce ideas that you understand, or perhaps an idea that you haven't come across yet. The ideas you'll understand are the idea of IQ, what you might call intellectual ability, EQ, what you might call emotional warmth, capacity to kind of engage with others, and what I want to describe, and I picked this up from a friend, so I can't claim originality for it, although I use it with great energy and enthusiasm, the idea of PQ. So what is PQ? PQ is the capacity to make things happen. It's a practical intelligence. Now, of course, this has a very ancient idea. Aristotle talks of a distinction between Sophia or philosophic wisdom and phronesis or practical wisdom. We have this ancient triptych of ideas, the tricolon of ideas: logos, pathos, ethos, reason, feeling, and then ethos, character, judgment of character, to which we might add praxis, another Greek word. So this idea that we should think of intelligence not just in terms of academic intellectual quality, but emotional skills, an ability to adapt to others and to shape a world around us in that way, to evolve emotionally in relation to others, and also practical skills, practical capability as being an aspect of human intelligence. And I don't mean to go down fashionable theories about multiple intelligence. I'm just giving you a very simple, easy to get hold of distinction, which I hope you find interesting. Now, why does this matter? So go back to the 19th century. It always used to be a fact about higher education in Britain, and it had many downsides as well as a potential upside, that it had tremendous emphasis on moral qualities and character. Now, you may recall that the Jowett reforms, Benjamin Jowett, who became famous master of Balliol College, Oxford, and rescued it from its long century of academic underperformance, then became Vice Chancellor of the University of Oxford. The Jowett reforms were themselves an attempt to recreate Oxford as a place of teaching. But they and of course, in particular, to promote a moral context alongside that, which allowed for the abolition of the test, the religious test, which had always existed in Oxford until, I guess, the 1840s and Cambridge 1850s, and then was ultimately abolished in this country in the Universities Test Act of 1871. So there was, for Jowett, an emphasis on teaching and learning, but also an emphasis on moral character, which reflected the historic religious preoccupations of higher education, the claims of Oxford and Cambridge as places where ordained members of the Church of England taught, to have a certain primacy in the education of young people. This was part of the point about higher education. Okay, but I want to put it to you that in the ensuing century, in the long withdrawing roar of empire, and in particular after the Second World War, this balance between teaching and learning on one side, the intellectual aspects, and then what you might call the practical, skills-based aspects, the moral character aspects, has been lost. And the paradox of this is therefore that university education has become massively intellectualized and has lost its connection, the connection it used to have via religion, but need not have via religion, could have via, in other ways, to personal character and other achievement. Now, it didn't do this in the United States of America. It's very interesting. It did not do this in the United States of America. In America, there has always been an emphasis on personal qualities and character. There was throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And there is now today a tremendous emphasis on what students can bring to their studies apart from their brains and their intellectual capability. So it's of enormous importance in American universities to have a diversity of incoming class. That doesn't just refer to a diversity of all the usual ways one might expect, sex and gender, religious and other orientation. It's also a diversity in terms of what you bring to the table. They positively want people who can show their capabilities as sportsmen and women, or as musicians, or as actors, or as philanthropists, volunteers, whatever it might be. Something that shows something about your moral character. Absolutely not at all in higher education in Britain. I mean, more in England than Scotland, but much less so. Now, in England, in the UK, this massive over-intellectualization of higher education has meant an enormous loss, I would suggest, of agency, of personal agency, and of practical achievement. And so, as a result, it has meant a loss of entrepreneurship and purpose and opportunity. After all, when people become educated, they don't become educated by a process of automatic absorption or osmosis, whereby information just comes off the page into their heads. They get educated because they work at making themselves educated, round, thoughtful, engaged people. It's the motivation. So those practical skills turn out to be that character, that resilience, that drive, that creativity turns out to be fundamental even to the process of becoming academically, intellectually educated. So I think this is a rather profound part of our current society and indeed our political economy. Now, when we bemoan our ability to get things done, something you see in the newspapers every day, part of the reason for that, I want to suggest, is deeply embedded in the assumptions governing our educational and in particular our higher education system. And of course, it's not unrelated to the idea of elite overproduction. I'm not going to get embedded in the idea whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, but this idea, of course, is that universities are producing lots of highly educated people, more than can be absorbed by, as it were, business life or public life. And this creates resentment and anger. But it is worth saying, I'm not going to get into that debate, I just notice it because I think it's important and interesting, potentially. But I will notice, I can't help saying, as a man who's just written a novel about Francis Bacon and Edward Cook, available in all good bookshops, absurdly low price. Wonderful stocking stuff. We're grateful of the members of the family who enjoy historical novel. But I can't help mentioning that Francis Bacon says in one of his essays, more are bred scholars than preferment can take off. So Bacon himself was aware of the possibility of disenchantment, resentment, if people, bred scholars, could not be brought into public life. And as the book demonstrates, this was his own condition for a large part of his earlier life. Okay, so with that in context, let me talk a little bit about this remarkable, what I think is a remarkable thing we're trying to do in Herefordshire, which is to create a Greenfield University called the New Modern Institute for Technology and Engineering. Now, it has been long in the making, and at least, I would say, 12 years now. It opened its doors in 2021 to students. It now has 2, and shortly will have 3 cohorts. Third to come in this September. At that time, it will have about 100 students on enroll, so still very small. But 100 students, let me remind you, is about the same as Harvard or Yale in the middle of the 18th century. How is it different? Well, it reflects a systematic attempt to rethink what a higher education institution should look like based on the best globally competitive models. Who are they? Well, Olin College, outside Boston, a remarkable institution which I thoroughly commend to you, did not exist 30 years ago, and now generally regarded as one of the top 3 or 4 engineering universities in America. Quest in Canada, very interesting institution. The University of Tilburg, the learning factories of Europe, well worth a detailed, close look. So the first way it's different is it attempts to take the best learning globally at the moment as to how you educate an engineer for the future. How does it work? It trains and teaches and encourages the learning by its students through intensive work in studio-based environment. Kids arrive at 9 in the morning, they get themselves organized, they start work at 10, they finish at 5, they don't do homework, they don't work at weekends. Those times are for volunteering, other activities, whatever they like. But they do work very hard in the meantime, 46 weeks in a year, on accelerated M.Eng and B.Eng degrees. These are not degrees that are going to be of automatic interest to people who want to give the free play to the life of the mind, but they are intensely interesting to a lot of young people who want to get on and be successful and learn their trade and learn their business and become highly effective, intellectually effective engineers as well as practically effective ones. It teaches them in these 3-week modules called sprints. So Professor Pabst gets the student for 3 weeks at a time to work on a problem or problem set, which has an intellectual, a practical, and a professional component to it, and which has a client or sponsor associated with it. So the very first sprint that NMITE ever taught, or as it were, had students learn, was set by a small environmental consultancy based in London, and the problem was to calculate the moisture content in a wooden structure, and then build a device for doing that. And the latest one it involves a FTSE 20 company involved in metal detection and mine clearance using bots. I mean, it's an astounding change. Less than 2 years to go from tiny environmental consultancy to some of the biggest companies in the world, I think is itself an indicator of how interesting this model is proving. Now, if you think about that, it's not hard to see why this might be a good way of training people. So take flight training, for an example. I don't know if anyone here has ever thought about getting a private pilot's license. I did it many years ago. I did exactly the wrong way, right? I was living in Boston. Every Saturday, I trooped out to the local airfield. I spent an hour flying around. I then spent a week forgetting what I'd learned, and I did the following. It's incredibly stupid. What I should have done was to go to Florida and spend 3 weeks actually learning to fly every day. Just get that stuff under your fingers, properly embedded, properly habituated, and then you're set up. This is what happens in this situation 17 times for these master students with a long project at the end. So they come out with an extraordinary array of different client situations, different practical problems, different intellectual challenges, with passages of reinforcement to go back and fill in anything that might be unclear, because obviously we're inviting people to engage in some really quite difficult work, intellectual work. This is what we're talking about. So it's a way of getting knowledge and skills and professional practice into some alignment and to allow them to be absorbed at the same time. And of course, who are these students? These students are young people who have been who have applied and who are evaluated not just on talent. They have to be able to do the course. It's a very demanding course, right? They have to be able to do the course, and the entrance process has to assess and takes pains to make sure they can do the course. Only 60%, only a little over 30% of these young people have maths A levels. So you need to have a maths capability in order to make sure that these people you're bringing into engineering can do the job. Okay, but they also recruit on character and personal qualities. So in the recruitment process, they look for 5 qualities: grit, curiosity, passion, creativity, and collaboration or partnership. Now, when you consider that 60% of these students do not have a maths A level and they're being taken to a master's level in engineering, you can see 2 things. One is how enormously wider the potential spectrum application becomes, and you think of the socioeconomic background of young people who may have had inadequate secondary school education in mathematics or etc., but nevertheless have great talent. You can see how wide that funnel potentially is, and you can see how interesting it is potentially to recruit more women into engineering, because it's well understood that the maths component and all of the kind of folder role that our society puts around maths has the effect of encouraging many women in particular to try to go into medicine rather than into engineering. This, by contrast with what we see in much elsewhere in the sector, is a form of medical school for engineering. You're in bodies from the very first week. When you go to medical school, you don't go into a body after 2 years, right? You do your course after 2 years. You're in bodies in the first week, because if you can't cut it like that, you're not going to enjoy it. You can't succeed. This is the same thing. You're going to be thinking about being an engineer from the very beginning, not just thinking about engineering as an academic subject. So how is this working out? How is it successful or not? And how successful is it? And how can we tell? So it's obviously early days. We're just coming to the end of the second year. We've got a third cohort to arrive in September. But both the objective measures and the subjective feedback are looking extremely promising. So the QAA assessment has been extremely positive. The external examiner role, which has been played hitherto by the Open University, has been extremely positive. We know from UCAS forms that universities that NMITE students, let's not forget, these are students who are being invited to go on a course in a place no one's ever heard of, Hereford, at a university no one's ever heard of, NMITE, to do a degree no one's ever heard of, okay, an acceleration masters in engineering, okay? So who are on their UCAS forms? The answer is Birmingham, Nottingham, and Cardiff. That is a pretty distinguished cohort for an institution that's not yet at the end of its second year. So that's exciting. And most interestingly, that first cohort that's going to graduate next year, university has reached out to local businesses to ask whether they'd be interested to hire, on the basis of a final interview, a student from that cohort. they had to stop after half the cohort had been placed because 15 places had already been given, so 30-person cohort, 15 places had already been given to local companies for master's degree students beginning at £30,000 a year. Now, £30,000 a year for an engineer anywhere in the UK is a big number. In Herefordshire, it's a very big number, right? This is a county that has underemployment, low levels of income, low GVA. And so that's a very, very interesting and telling statistic to my mind. So what's the plan? The plan is simple. Prove the model. Make sure that it's absolutely understood that for a certain, potentially quite large class of students, not adequately served at the moment, a reservoir of talent that we're not properly deploying in the UK at the moment. Make sure that this model really works for them, really delivers the good, and then replicate it, and then work with partner cities, small cities and large towns around the country to replicate it. Now, what will we be looking for? Well, we'll be looking for places which are HE not spots with low economic gross value added. Now, I don't need to tell you, there's a lot of them around, right? I mean, tragically, it's an appalling fact about the way in which regional development has occurred in the UK over many, many years. But let me just give you some places which this would apply to: Chatham, Southend, Taunton, Macclesfield, Chesterfield, Wakefield, Doncaster. I mean, there are lots and lots of places where this potentially applies to. So we're interested in turning this into the small modular nuclear reactor of higher education and levelling up. You drop it into a place, you graft it onto an institution context where you have to be very demanding to make sure that institutional context is right. Everyone's got to be on side. There can be no party politics. Council's got to be on side, business got to be on side. Everyone's got to want to make it happen. One's got to put something in the pot to make it happen. And then you can potentially make a huge, huge difference. And of course, that in turn could be a huge difference to levelling up. Now, why does it matter? I think I've given you some reasons why it matters, but let me just round off with a few thoughts that just might crystallize this. The first is the recognition that this skills-based approach reinforces academic learning. It reinforces that. It's just a mistake to think in these subjects, and potentially in many other subjects, that this intellectual vocation, academic vocationalist thing is actually a way it starts to look like a defensive way of protecting the intellectuals rather than a way of actually making them better. And it's certainly socially prejudicial and economically prejudicial. And of course, what it means is the mobilization of tacit knowledge. One thinks about Michael Oakeshott's idea of tacit knowledge, or Polanyi, very, very interesting idea. Knowledge possessed by craftsmen and women, itself a guard against rationalism, against the idea that the arrogance of an idea that the unaided human reason is the measure of all things, all theory and practice. And so that, in particular, the ability to govern or indeed undertake any practical activity can be reduced to a set of explicit rules or instructions. The second thing is it highlights and emphasizes the centrality of productive work and of place. Two concepts that dropped out of the idea of the way in which we think about the moral purpose of the university and the moral purpose of higher education, but which give enormous meaning to students. Productive work, including the idea that what is made outlasts the maker. It's the difference, and this may strike a chord given the way in which what we see around us today. It's the difference between boastful self-assertion versus a well-founded pride in one's own achievements. It's also a key way to address levelling up. One of the lessons of COVID, I would suggest, is that we cannot reduce inequality by the simple act of moving people to jobs. We must move skills to people wherever they are. And the more they are unlikely to move, the more they need those skills. All the more so if the economists, I'm thinking of people like Alan Blinder, are right, and there will be increasing demand for place-dependent jobs in a world of automation and AI. And there's a final lesson here. For conservatives, I don't mean political conservatives. I mean small c conservatives, which I take to be more or less everyone. People who believe in, I'm serious, people who believe in prudence and the importance of society and tradition, those kinds of people. And there's a final lesson. Reform is in our way of talking about reforming, right? So forming again something that existed before. So it's something that you cannot do reform without having an intellectually imaginative idea of what it is you're seeking to achieve and an awareness of the whole and the desired ideal. And I want to suggest that people of a conservative disposition, wherever they may be found, are or should be not projectors, as Adam Smith would have put it, but repairmen and women who make things better and put themselves at the service of others. And where better than in higher education? Thank you very much. Very happy to take your questions.
Well, Jesse, thank you very, very much. That was really fascinating, incredibly rich. You know, I can think of so many things, but I was very struck by some of the paradoxes, you know, the intellectual and the practical, they're not opposed, they're mutually augmenting. This idea that if you want a transformation, as Carl Polanyi would have said, you need to do it both prudently, but also boldly. And so much else that you touched upon. I think really, really fascinating. Also, this emphasis on moral character, the importance of forming character, not only giving people abstract knowledge or skills, because often it's character that binds it together, so that people can have pride in a job well done. Let me open up to questions. I'll take them in three. I'll start with this side, and then we'll go around the room.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Norman, for your talk. It was very nicely presented. I spent about 50% of my life teaching in universities in Australia, Britain, and Germany. I have worked in other things like banking, financial journalism, transport, brewing, and one or two other things. One of the things that struck me about your proposals for the technological or science-based university is that mathematics is underlying, in fact, a lot of things. Here in Britain, this is where we're inadequate. In 1964 or 5, by the way, I belong to two mathematical associations. I am not a proper mathematician, far from it. I use maths, so I'm used to do my work. They undertook a study of what percentage of A-level pupils who are preparing for mathematics at A-level were taught by qualified mathematicians. It was just over 30%. The study was again repeated by the Mathematical Association, the Royal Society, and the London Mathematical Society. And again, that hasn't changed. So we've got people who perhaps want to be studying engineering. There's perhaps a 2/3 chance that most of them are not being taught, in fact, by properly qualified mathematicians. It's quite interesting to contrast the situation in Germany, where even at the primary level, anybody teaching mathematics at the primary level has to have a qualification in mathematics. We're actually way behind. And I don't know how that situation is going to be changed in the situation here, where anybody who does graduate in mathematics is going to go into school teaching when they can be offered salaries 3 or 4 times in the fields of finance and elsewhere. I think we've got a huge problem. One thing that I would add, I read economics and statistics at university. The thing that was most fruitful to me was neither of those subjects, but philosophy.
Just maybe your name, and then we'll move on to next.
I saw I thought I pronounced my name, Paul Hudson. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Paul. Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
Peter Gordon. Interesting how age comes into this. Also, one of the problems with the traditional apprenticeships is very good at teaching you for a particular role, but that role might change. And so these days, you're probably going to do several careers in your lifetime. It's actually interesting that I did a degree when I was in my 30s, wanting to change my direction. Now, there are lots of people who've gone down the same role. Questions are really, do you think education actually coaches people later in their careers who want to change direction, either because they're not happy what they're doing or simply because the job market changes? And your university, what sort of debate will it be exclusively youngsters or maybe healthy or people as well?
Thank you very much. Third question, anyone for now? Yes, please, Ed. And we'll take Lisa as well. She's just raised her hand. Go ahead. Ed.
Hi, Greenfield from NIESR. I think one of my questions is about the perception of higher education, because I think a lot of people have a somewhat classist view that you need to go to university to kind of be a better person. They look down on apprenticeships and look down on opportunities. I think that's something that we need to deal with as a society, and make them realize that there are other pathways that they can take that are just as valid, if not more so. So I was wondering how you thought about that and how we kind of change that perception in society.
Thank you, Lisa McSorley, NIESR. Just in terms of the question, I think a lot of the criticisms about universities, it's really come from new public management, where universities are run more like businesses, and a lot of the emphasis has been on standardization, league table position, trying to standardize a lot of the education to make it more efficient or make it more productive. Do you think we should maybe just focus on fixing our universities and getting them back to places of higher education rather than the kind of money-making machines that they're kind of viewed as today?
Jesse.
Fabulous questions. Thank you all very much indeed. And let me just, so each of them deserves a proper response. So if I may, I'm just going to spend a second on each of them. Question about mathematics and levels of maths teaching. I think it's an inevitable fact about society that if someone has gone through the process of becoming a qualified mathematician, which for you seems to mean having a degree in mathematics, then they are going to go and do something that uses, you know, they will have a strong economic incentive to use that degree in whichever way they possibly can, to best advantage. And in a world which is proliferating with uses of mathematics or advanced abstract logical reasoning in AI and other areas, it's not surprising that those people, and say we go for physicists too, are going to get pulled into jobs that take them away from teaching. So that's the bad news. The good news is, I'm not sure your diagnosis is correct, for two reasons. I mean, you can do a lot of learning of maths online. Spend some time on the Khan Academies and some of these other things, and they're phenomenally effective at teaching people how to do maths. And they have the great merit that you can do them again and again until you get the hang of it. You don't have to look stupid. You don't have to worry about putting your hand up in a class and saying, I'm sorry, I don't get how does this differentiation thing work anyway. You can just do it and you can just get it. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, there isn't, when you think about teachers, it depends what level of teacher you're talking about. But I just want someone who's good enough to be able to teach the course in all the maths that's required for that course. And I think if you require everyone to be a Regius Professor in mathematics in order to teach introductory calculus, then you're inevitably making a problem, creating a problem for yourself. And so inevitably there's going to be a kind of waterfall effect where people will be teaching stuff that they've become familiar with. And the key thing is, are they doing it well enough? Are they effective enough? And if they're not effective, then we need to find ways of just weeding them out and giving people a proper ability to learn. And then on the wider point, of course, we need to defang and demystify and remove the social panic and worry about this. But how do you do that? The answer is you give people fun problems to solve in engineering, which require a bit of maths. Believe me, the motivation changes massively when you realize that, whether you can win the game, which involves getting the cappuccino to the professor via the artificially intelligence directed bot, that, believe me, that's going to teach you a lot of math very quickly, because motivation is everything in teaching. So that would be my broad response. On the issue Peter raised about late careers, yeah, Peter, where are you? Yeah, very, very good question. Thank you very much. I mean, all great questions, but that's a really important one. I mean, yes, the answer is, the oldest student at NMITE at the moment is 30. It's absolutely understood, and it's really important for this kind of engineering and other education in general, that it should be open all the way through people's lives, in my judgment. And the lifelong learning entitlement, which the government's coming up with, is going to be, your lifelong learning process is going to be an incredibly important adjunct to that. That's as far as I'm going to get into current educational policy, but that really supports that. And there's this really important idea, you all know, RPEL, recognized prior experiential learning. Now, in a place like Hereford, got lots of people who've been in the military in it, the ability to take someone who's got 20 years in the signals regiment and say, by the way, we're going to take your phenomenal expertise and say, we're going to wrap some academic stuff around it. You're going to have a degree that's life transforming in terms of revenue, future possibilities. So it's what you might think of as, the process of creating much more of a really intellectual property driven kind of group of businesses coming out of the armed forces. I think there's every opportunity to do that. So yes, Ed's question about potential of perception of HE, I agree with you about that. Let's think about it all depends what you think about reason. So human reason, because the dominant view of human reason for many years was, it's the sublime faculty that distinguishes humans from other animals, or indeed places them on a potentially divine level, and it's what allows them to choose between alternatives and make choices that benefit them in the longer run. Okay, nonsense, right? No one thinks that now. Okay, let's spend some time. There's a book written by Dan Spelbert, the French philosopher psychologist recently, kind of makes this point. Hume is right? I mean, reason is and must always be the slave of the passions, and so the passions make the decision. And what is reason? Reason is a way of explaining why we were right all along. Now, if people have made decisions to go into higher education that they regret, do they go, jeepers creepers, I made a horrible mistake, I've blown all this money, my parents are there? So of course they don't. They say that's why I was right all along. So we've got to find ways, and of course they do this in America. If you say to someone, where do you go? And someone says, well, I went to Harvard, or someone says, I went to, Michigan, big state college, or I went to Harvey Mudd, specialist tech college, Rensselaer, no one, the hierarchies do not exist in the same way. And that's fantastic. You've got some genuinely diverse. So diversity will cure a lot of that problem, provided it's correlated with quality and outcomes. And then final point, Lisa's question about new public management is very interesting. Listen, I mean, you need to, I'm going to outsource a part of my speech because you filled in some very important, useful gaps. Of course, it's true. One of the ways in which, this is a point White's making essentially when he talks about the homogenization, the conventionalization of 20th century universities. And one of the ways they've become conventions is not just they've absorbed the same aspects in terms of what teaching is and what universities should look like, but also how they should be run. Our vice chancellors get paid an absolute packet, and there's a cascade of kind of, wannabes sitting underneath. It's all horrible. What they should do is just think about how can we get this kid from wherever they are now to being fantastically well educated. And actually, if they defined it not in terms of just scooping off whatever their tier was, but actually finding people who might have had very little access to higher education and genuinely transformingly educating them, that's something a person could die for. That's an ideal worth dying for. Anyway, that's my view.
Thank you very much. I'll take another round of questions, possibly the last one, depending on when.
Sorry about that. I bashed on a bit, but I didn't know how many other questions were going to be.
I'm sure we're going to have more questions. So Sebastian, Butt, and Judge.
I'm interested in this question of skills-based education, because when I was at school, not so very long ago, that's all I ever heard about. But the problem is, at the moment you say, well, we're the government, want you to do something for school, you need to do skills-based education, here are the outcomes we want. So thinking about how do we measure skills-based education and what's our procedure? And then a few committees later, you've got everyone talking about something that nobody actually does. And I'm interested in that point you made about classroom versus book-based technical education versus apprenticeships, because in an apprenticeship nobody measures how the apprentice is doing in a very close way. They do the thing, and then there's no sort of division. You simply you watch someone who knows what they do something, and you organically learn something by being around people trying to do a task. And I worry that schools are a very good place to learn certain kind of skills, but a very bad place to learn others.
Well, so I'm talking about you. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It's okay. We
of course. Yeah. Sorry, Sebastian. Yeah. Sorry. Who's next? Yeah.
Bart van Aert, Productivity Institute. I was wondering if you can make the circle around and come back to Barbauld's hypothesis where you started, and whether the proposals that you're putting forward here, if you expand this more widely across the country, would that improve the productivity of schools and basically challenge Barbauld's hypothesis that actually the education system can be more productive? And I think that's an interesting thing to look at the moment. The Chancellor, as you know, has just proposed another round of efficiency gains in the public sector. So we're looking for good outcomes, and at the same time, we're also looking for more efficiency and productivity in the public sector. So I wonder if you can sort of make the circle around and come back to that in your answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Jesse. Always a pleasure to hear you speak. One of the great things about NIESR is we learn from each other. So Adrian is a professor of political science, has been giving me lots of things to read. And one of them is Camus,
Right.
The Rebel.
Yes.
So I was reminded of it when you said that everyone's a conservative. And there's a danger, isn't there, if we look back in time, to think that developments were inevitable, that everyone agreed. But I happen to know that when Broome thought about starting University College, there was an awful furore.
Absolutely.
It's the so-called godless institutional calendar.
Quite.
And there was a rival university set up, whose name I will not mention in this room. There's another university set up down the road there.
A monarchical,
Exactly.
reactionary institution.
Anyway, so it seems to me a kind of interesting question about when we need radical reform. At what point are we so out of whack that the elasticity that we're facing requires a break and a change? So I'll try to give an example. I mean, I think, and people also know I'm not so good with the numbers sometimes, but NEETs, not in employment, education, and training, it's 750,000 people. It's a huge number of people out of work. And recently, I think on Monday, members of the Conservative Party put forward some proposals on stopping immigration, so that would be a greater incentive to train people domestically who are not currently wanting to find work. So I'm wondering, what should we be doing there for these people who seem to be the ones that we're letting down generation after generation? What can we do that's more radical for these people who are not currently going to work?
I took four questions in the first round. I'll do the same here for reasons of symmetry. So Morris.
Oh, very nice. Morris.
Jesse, good to see you. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah. So, Jesse, it's about this radical nature of the reform, and just, you know, three linked points. So I'm viewing what you're saying as a bit of a free radical floating around, but first of all, the pathway that we're on is an incredible incentive of people going to university, and the crisis and the standards of the university links back to your point about contempt for vocation and apprenticeship. I mean, I got into a lot of trouble a while ago for suggesting that we closed half the universities, turned them into vocational colleges, and put the medical schools in the vocational colleges, and dentistry and accountancy. I actually got a legal notice from the BMA and the Law Society.
It's like being banned by Putin. You know one unless you've had a legal notice from the BMA.
But it gave me an indication of the entrenched nature of the academic system and the hostility to these things. So to what extent can this be embedded in what you were saying, which is a much more radical reform of the higher education sector, in which something like what you're talking about would be a central component and across the piece, if you like, in relation to all manner of vocational and technical skills.
Okay, fantastic. Another four cracking questions. Thank you very much indeed. Sebastian asked about skills-based education. So my view on that is this. I haven't mentioned government. I haven't used the word government, I think, once in my speech. And so you're bringing in I'm operating at the level of the institution rather than the level of government policy. And I understand the concern you're making, but in a way, this is also a response to Morris, which is I'm miles away from what policy is. I'm more in the space of allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom, backing success, and then replicating it. So my view on radicalism is almost never a good idea because it destroys tacit knowledge and arrangements in society. Almost very often for no gain, in fact, often negative gain. But when you get radical change, you often get it as a result of some stuff that's already happening, which you've just decided to lean into rather than what you have at the moment. So you'll appreciate that, you know, for someone who's trying to revolutionize the higher education sector, which in some respects I am, well, I'm going to run a very slow way. I've got 100 students in a college. We're going to try and make the thing work. We're going to test it over the next year or two, see if it works, and then we'll try and do another one. But if that's the case, if we're right, this is about a mousetrap, right? This is going to generate, I would like this to generate, it goes to Bart's point, very, very significant productivity gains. And those productivity gains particularly in three ways. One is a better education. The second is to a much wider spectrum of people who people had not previously regarded as suitable, quote unquote, or potential for a quote unquote university education, let alone to masters. And the third is potentially at a lower cost. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't do it without having to buy into the very cost heavy structures of the new public management that's already been touched on by Lisa. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which we can drive productivity gain. There's at least three ways that we can drive productivity gain while respecting this point about skills-based education. I do think there are other places in which we could drive a more practical component. I mean, I don't think you're going to be teaching. I was thinking about this the other day. Imagine you had a classic course where, as part of the language component, I mean, I did classics at Oxford. It had languages, it had history, and had philosophy. So imagine the languages component involved doing a statistics module so that you could work out, you knew how to run models of relative frequency for textual analysis. Okay, imagine that the historical component involved a mandatory archaeology course or component. You can just see how, would this person end up as a better classicist? Of course they would. They'd be 100 times, and they'd be a better human being as well. And I think they'd have more agency. So I think there's actually lots of different ways in which we could potentially practicize, if you like, what we think of as academic elite education. And I think we can do so in different ways that liberate forms of productivity that respond to Bart's point about balance cost disease and allow us genuine change. Quite interesting. If you talk to some of these big companies I was just telling you about, is FTSE 50 companies in engineering, what they're excited about is that, so the standard view is they get a student from one of the classic STEM engineering universities, where it takes them 2 years to be effective because they don't have any agency. They've never actually done any engineering, right? If engineering involves running a model, or if engineering involves doing some coding, then they'll hit the ground running faster. But in terms of actually being a productive employee, it's 2 years. Okay, so any change there is a massive productivity spike, right? They're paying those people, they're recruiting them from Oxbridge and Russell Group universities. They're paying them a fortune, not getting any benefit from them for 2 years. That's an enormous productivity gain. So huge amounts of gain there. Let me just say one other point about, so this point about Jadrik's point. I'm for the reasons I've described, I'm hostile to radicalism and pro-reform. And the more I think about reform, is done properly, the more you get dramatically enhanced improvement, because you've really, as it were, learned your trade, improved your outcomes. And I'm, is there a way in which we could do that for NEETs? Of course there is. Of course there is. I mean, one of the kids that NMITE took worked on the co-creation component, which was the original design cohort, helping them to design the opening curriculum. So this was a guy who worked on a farm, got in, joined the design cohort. At the end of the design cohort, they weren't ready to set up to go with the university. We were about to hit COVID and stuff like that. So he went back to work on the farm. Okay, when they opened, he came back on the farm and went to work at the university. So as a student, so it's absolutely possible to take. That's not a neat example, but we're talking about people who might be just lost to higher education, wouldn't necessarily think of it in those terms. And of course, one of the reasons they'll do it is because it doesn't feel academically remote. It doesn't feel like it's a form of class warfare in disguise. They don't feel they can having to stop talking to their parents or grandparents by doing it. Do you see what I mean? It's a very, very important thing, but they're going to get a bang of an education. Okay, final point, which was this point about people going to university, vocational colleges, and the BMA. Of course, how far can we embed radical reform? I think hugely. But you have to do it quietly, and you have to do it through experimentation and results. And if you start making big, government announcements, there are all these people who want to disagree. And Maurice, I think you missed it, but I just reminded everyone in the early part of the talk of the experience of the Diocese of Lincoln when they want to set up a new university in the year 1333 to 4, and Oxford and Cambridge detected this potential threat to their duopoly, joined forces, and had it killed by a direct petition to Edward III. So nothing has changed in higher education, but that just gives you a sense as to how, which is why institutions like the Open University, which has retained a degree of radicalism and drive and focus and openness, remains so important. Anyway, listen, folks, I think we've overrun. It's been a phenomenally interesting conversation for me. I hope it's been useful to you, and I couldn't thank you enough for all your wonderful questions. Thank you very much indeed.